Hello and welcome to episode 102 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm the father of the most beautiful beast in the world, Jerry, and it is almost time for the greatest time of year. Yes, that's right, folks. It is time to engage in 17 weeks of mental warfare against our mortal DFS enemies. For that, I'm joined by two of the best DFS players of all time, two young men who've won a Million Maker, won live finals, who actually play MME in a very thoughtful way, which I actually didn't think was possible. It is our own Drew Dinkmeyer and Mike Leone. Leone, what's going on?
Getting, ready to go for the start of the NFL season. It's one of those things where with COVID going on and everything, it sneaks up on you a little bit more because there was some uncertainty about the season, but it seems like all systems are go now. So pretty pumped looking at these week one contests, knowing that we're about a week or two out.
Yep. And I know Leone spent a lot of time talking about season long. I've spent a lot of time talking about season long. Drew spent a lot of time talking about NBA. We all know where our bread is buttered, though, Drew, in the NFL streets. Max variance, max upside, all of it. What's going on?
Yeah, it's you want to talk about sneaking up on you guys. Good Lord, I'm not used to NBA playoffs going on when the NFL season is starting. So it's been an adjustment for me as well, but I'm super excited. It's obviously the time of the year where, as a professional DFS player, you can make or break your year with just one great week, which is the great thing about NFL DFS, especially these huge large field tournaments that I'm super excited to attack.
Yep. Okay. On today's show, we are going to talk specifically about how to play NFL DFS tournaments correctly. Before we get into that, wanted to remind everyone that our bundle package is live. It's by far our best deal, combines the draft kit with the in-season package. If you want to know what's in our in-season package, you can find the full schedule on the site. But basically, it's what myself, Evan, Drew, Leone, Wiggins, Taylor, what we think you actually need to win in NFL DFS and in season 2. If you currently have the draft kit and you want to upgrade to bundle, please email support@establishTheRun.com. Again, if you have the draft kit, you want to upgrade to bundle, please email support@establishTheRun.com. Also, want to remind everybody listening to this free podcast, starting next week, Evan and I's Friday night show, Dink and Leone's Saturday show, which will be about NFL DFS tournaments, Evan and I's Sunday show in the morning after inactives come out. Those will no longer be on this free feed. They will be behind the paywall. Okay, let's get to it. First of all, let me get this off my chest and then you guys can respond. I have often, over the last few years, busted balls about large field tournaments, called them lotteries, disrespected tournament players. And it's mostly a bit, right? It's mostly tongue in cheek. But I do think that these extreme large field tournaments where you need to beat, 100K, 200K, 300K people or whatever, and you need the actual nut lineup to win, and all the money goes to first, and if you get 10th, you're like dusted. I actually think that they're pretty silly. And I know that's not a fun take, right? Adam's not about fun. Adam's not about trying to turn $20 into million. And I get that. Maybe it's not true. Maybe I'm not about fun. But am I wrong, Drew? Am I wrong to bust balls about people who call themselves, professional large field DFS players and stuff like that? It just seems so crazy to me.
Well, I would say that it's certainly a game type that really shouldn't be meant for everyone, even though that it is, because really to withstand the variance associated with the game type, you need to have a massive bankroll. And so for somebody like me who's won a Million Maker before, like I can play these and it won't have a huge impact, the excessive losing that I will be doing in these for a period of time. But for kind of the casual player that's wanting to, run up and jam in 150 lineups at, 3K total, on a given week, the losses can pile up pretty quickly because it is very difficult when so much of the prize pool is tied up at the very top. And so it really depends on the person and kind of what kind of bankroll they have and what kind of expectations they have. But I think these tournaments are really difficult. If you want to have kind of more consistent results and a little bit less variance, you should be focusing on some of those smaller field tournaments, single entry, 3 max, stuff like that. You can always look for, some of those promotional tournaments that can kind of come rake free and whatnot that can help as well. But the basic idea is the larger the field, the higher the percentage of the prize pool that's tied up in the very top few spots, the longer it's going to take your expectation to be realized in those tournaments, which means you need to have the size of bankroll to be able to withstand the variance in those tournaments.
Yeah. And I want to be clear that I'm not against people playing the Millie Maker who are just trying to have fun. Go out there, have fun, take on a negative expectation. Like most of the people listening to this, that should 100% be what you're playing. We're going to help you try not to have as much of a negative expectation. I just released an article about game selection, and in there I talked about what you said, figuring out what your goals are. If your goals are just to fire off and have fun, that's awesome. Like we can help you not be as big of a dog in large field tournaments. Just know that these tournaments in general are negative expectation. You can have a more positive expectation following some of the advice that I gave in that game selection article, which is actually free up on the site. And I know, Leone, you play a lot of these smaller field stuff. You don't resort to the straight cash game, no fun stuff like I do, but a lot of the smaller field, higher stakes stuff, I assume you prefer that to the large field stuff, and talk to the people about why and a little bit of the strategy that goes into that versus some of the large field stuff.
Yeah, I do prefer some of the smaller field tournament type stuff. And for some of the reasons that you mentioned, if I have a top 10 team, I really want to get paid off. And it's difficult to do that when so much of the prize pool is in first place. Like some of these prize pools will have 100K to first place and $1,000 to 10th place. And that disparity for me is just too much to swallow. I don't care too much about how many total spots a tournament pays out. I don't care too much if the min cash payout is 2x or if it's a little bit less than that. But what I do care about is the top 10 payouts. When I'm looking at those and I have a top 1% team, I want to get paid off. So I want a little bit of a flatter payout structure up top. I want second place to be at least half of first place. I want ideally that 9th, 10th place payout to be about 10% of what the first place prize is. And I think too, in these smaller field tournaments, for me, it's a little bit more fun. You mentioned the fun of chasing the Millie Maker. I think it's fun to be able to actually have a good chance of winning a tournament over the course of a season. So I like being able to compete. And if you're playing in 300-man tournaments, even 100-man tournaments, you have a decent shot of actually taking one of these down over the course of the season. And I also think with late swap on DraftKings in particular, you can take advantage of some things in smaller field tournaments that are a bit more obvious to help increase your expected value. You can play against your opponents a little bit more. You learn more about what people are doing in these smaller field tournaments. Sometimes people are just entering their cash lineups, which gives you a big edge if you're entering tournament lineups. So there's a multitude of reasons why I like, these smaller field tournaments, even if you do sacrifice some of the bank equity up top.
Yeah. I think one thing for me is like, I just know myself, and I know that like, if you can you can be playing tournaments and large field tournaments really well, and you can be playing really strong, and you can still lose for 5, 6, 7 weeks in a row. And I know myself, and I just get tilted, and it's just not for me, even though if I'm playing well, maybe I'll realize my expectation in week 10, or I'll realize my expectation in one of the next 2 years, and I'll end up a big winner. But like, taking on all that losing is really tilting for me. And so I've stuck mostly to cash, which obviously we'll talk more about on the Friday night shows this season, and more optimal type stuff and what Evan and I and Andrew think is right. And then Drew and Mike will come in and talk about what's right from a tournament perspective, which is actually kind of a different story on Saturdays. Other thing I'd mention about some of this large field stuff, a lot of people talk about the rake, and yeah, it's 16%. Like in the DraftKings Millie Maker, yeah, the rake is 16%. There are so many egregious lineups that are like drawing dead. The effective rake is probably way less. And Drew, I know you've talked about small dollar, large field stuff. I mean, yeah, the rake is high, but a lot of the players are so bad. They're drawing so slim that I actually don't think the rake is as imposing as people make it out to be. Now, if you were playing a 1K with 16% rake, that would be a different story. So yeah, it's just one point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, I would totally agree there. It's one of the reasons that I've transitioned to kind of these large field MME tournaments over time is one, that I can withstand the variance with the bankroll associated. It is very difficult on the emotional side of things, just dealing with so much losing over and over again, even when you feel like you're doing things correctly, or those opportunities that you get, like you feel like you nailed the slate. And like I had this in NBA last night, and I finished like 8th and 10th in DK MME, and it just wasn't like I didn't make that much money, and I had 2 top 10s, and it was just like it can be maddening. The difference between a few points can really dictate your results. But the edge, I think is the highest in these games. You're getting the highest percentage of casual users chasing kind of the really big prize pools. You're getting a lot of users who aren't adjusting to news, who aren't adjusting their lineups based on early performance. And so you're getting a lot of incremental value on top of the competition that you're playing against if you're playing these intelligently. And so that's kind of why I've made this move over time, is I just feel like even though the variance is going to be very, very difficult and very frustrating to withstand at times, the ROI over a long sample for me is quite good.
Right. Okay. We've talked long enough about negatively about these. I want to talk positively about them, because I do think that it's great fun. And I do think that a lot of the research that we did leading up to the Millie Maker Trends article that was up for free on the site, still is up for free on the site, led us to some good conclusions that can help us build better lineups for large field tournaments. Okay, we're going to talk about maybe 5, 6, 7 points here that we think you should have in mind when you're building lineups for large field tournaments. This is not optimizer style. This is just thoughts, general thoughts about building large field tournaments. Let's start with how much salary. You hear people say all the time, Leone, don't use $50,000 worth of cap. The cap on DraftKings is $50,000. Don't use all $50,000 because you're more likely to be duped. You're more likely to be duplicated. And obviously, chopping $1 million with somebody, I would do inhumane things for $500,000. I really would. But from an EV perspective, if you're already duped going into the tournament, your EV going into the tournament is a disaster. So you don't want to be duped. That said, I'm not sure that actually spending $50K is that big of a disadvantage. Leone, what did we find about how much salary cap we should be using in large field tournaments?
Yeah, it's almost no consideration. We actually found the percentage of salary used for the top 10 teams in the Millie Maker the last 3 years. They used the full cap, or $49,900, at a much higher rate than the field did. So I think sometimes in showdown slates where there's going to be a ton of dupes and they're unavoidable, yeah, you might want to limit the salary cap, but there's so many combinations on a main slate that the more you limit salary, and the salaries do have a positive correlation to fantasy production, the more you limit salary, the more you're likely limiting the ceiling of your team. So there's different ways to get unique. Capping salary is not where you want to start. There are some contests, again, where that makes sense, but the Millie Maker, in my opinion, is not one of them.
Yeah. And I don't think we have to be as price sensitive in NFL as NBA. So, I know, Drew, you would hate to leave 400 on the table in NBA, in a full NBA slate, right? That would be really bad. In NFL, if it happens that I leave 400, I'm okay with it. If it happens that I leave 200, I'm okay with it. If it happens that I use the full cap, I'm okay with it. I think what we're saying is it's not a huge consideration. How price sensitive are you getting in these tournaments, Drew, both from how much you're using and price sensitivity on players?
Yeah, so the thing that I'd stress most there, just because the real take home point there is that you have to adjust your thought process for the amount of combinations and the amount of slate size that you're dealing with. And so on these full slates for the Millie Maker, I don't think you need to consider salary whatsoever. I don't have any sort of restrictions in mind. If I have lineups that end up leaving some salary, that's fine. If I have lineups that use the full cap, that's fine. When you shrink the slate size, though, considerably, in the number of duplicates that you're talking about goes up from potentially duplicating with 1 or 2 to duplicating with 1 or 200. Then you want to start to consider those things. So in terms of teaching people how to think through these GPP processes, you really need to understand the context of the game that you're playing. In the context of the game that you're playing, a lot of people will think in terms of field size, in terms of rake, in terms of payout structure. You need to think of it in the context of the slate as well. So for me, it's not a point of consideration at all on full main slates. Once you get down to playoff DFS and stuff like that with 4-game slates, I will look at it a little bit, but generally what I'll do is I'll run all my lineups and then I'll look to see how many lineups are coming in kind of at the full cap and decide if these are going to be so heavily duped that I need to move off. In football, generally, there's so many combinations that you can work around it. Other sports, it becomes a little bit more challenging.
For sure. Okay. Let's talk about the flex. Everybody wants to know on DraftKings, what position should I be using in the flex? And so there was a time in DraftKings DFS where it was the quote unquote sharp play. And I never really agreed with this, but a lot of people said it was sharp to use tight end in the flex because A, it's unique, because B, tight ends are often underpriced on DraftKings. I just never thought that the ceiling was high enough to pay off a large field tournament with tight end in the flex. Leone, what did we find about what positions we should be using in the flex?
I think you're mostly accurate with the take on tight end. It's just hard to get that huge ceiling, especially in a Millie Maker type tournament where you don't need an 80th percentile type outcome. You need a 100th percentile outcome. And for the receiver, that's going to be a lot larger than tight end. So we saw the field and the top 10 teams were pretty similar, using about tight end in the flex around 10% of the time, wide receivers about a third of the time, and running backs about a half the time. Going into it, I thought I would see a lot of leverage in using receiver at flex because a little bit more high variance there than with running backs. But in reality, we didn't see much leverage there. And I think it's because when you get those running backs that are high priced, workhorse type running backs, the volume there is just so tough to compete with, regardless of the variance of the wide receiver position. And it gives you such a high ceiling when you're a running back that's going to see 7 to 8 targets, 15 to 20 carries, and the goal line work. The ceilings are just huge on those. So I'm not as pro wide receiver and flex as I was going into doing this research. I think it's fine, especially if you're doing game stacks. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but a consistent theme was the workhorse running backs are really important to play, even in a large field tournament.
And Drew, do you ever play tight end in the flex in a large field setting? And how do you think about from a slate to a slate what you want in your flex running back or wide receiver?
Yeah, so I'll allow it to happen, but I won't specifically force it in any way, shape, or form. And the other point that I wanted to hop on the running back is not only is the high end volume nearly impossible to recreate at other positions, but running back is also the position because the pricing comes out early in the week and is static, it can't move. It is also the position that is most impacted by players being mispriced due to injury or different situations like that. So both on the high end of the running back pricing spectrum and on the low end of the running back pricing spectrum, you generally have volume situations that can't be replicated by other positions. And so that's why I don't mind having a higher percentage of my lineups having running back and flex. I think it also creates generally like a nicer floor as well. So if you're playing in kind of smaller field tournaments where you don't have to have like the absolute nuts, I think it's even a little bit more valuable to prioritize running backs and flex. But really, like the structure of my lineups, I don't give a lot of specific thought to who is in the flex situation. I kind of, large scale, I start at the idea of like conceptually, what do I want this lineup to look like from a correlation perspective and from a stack perspective? And if running backs happen to fit in that category as filling out the flex, that's fine. If it's, two teams, if it's, San Francisco playing Kansas City and Kittle and Kelsey are in a game and I'm trying to game stack, I'm fine having tight ends. It's just, it kind of is more of a macro decision for me that trickles down to the micro decision on the flex that really is just the end result of a process.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get to the good stuff now. Everybody wants to talk about stacking. I think people listening to this, I hope you are stacking at least one way when you're playing something like the Millie Maker. What we mean by stacking, for those who don't know, is simply playing your quarterback with a pass catcher, one of them. Now, DFS has gotten to a point where there's a lot of people double stacking. There's people triple stacking. And then we're going to talk about next, bring it back. I don't want to talk about bring it back yet. At this point, Leone, I just want to talk about simple stacking. What can we tell the people about what is right, what we think is right in terms of single, double, and triple stacks? And to be clear, single stack means quarterback with one of his pass catchers, double stack with two, and triple stack with three.
If you were to blindly pick one stack type to make, it would be the double stack with one wide receiver, and then the other pass catcher could be running back, wide receiver, tight end. It doesn't matter too much. Did see that tight end correlates a little bit more with quarterback than the other positions as far as utility of that player, which makes sense because it's more touchdown dependent position, especially when you look at the cheaper guys. So if the quarterback goes off, that tight end's likely going to go off. If the quarterback doesn't, that tight end's floor is going to be really shaky. But really, two pass catchers was the most leverage we saw. That the top 10 teams did this a much higher amount than the field did it. And I think in a Millie Maker type tournament, it's harder to get past the double stack because you need to be so perfect and hit the nuts. And this is where correlation and stacking sometimes I think it's confusing for people. But the larger the tournament, the more you need to hit the nuts. You don't want to stack too much because it's unlikely all those players are going to be the best option at their position. Where the correlation helps a lot is it increases your probability of getting high ceiling outcomes in the exact same game by only having to get one thing right. If I take a quarterback and two wide receivers, I just need that offense to do well. And all three of those players are likely going to do well, even if they don't do insanely well. So in smaller field tournaments, I do think there's more room to doing a larger onslaught type stack where you could take, three receivers and two guys coming back from the other team and do a big game stack because the correlation matters a little bit more and you don't need to hit the pure nuts to win the tournament. So you're okay sacrificing a little bit of ceiling to increase that correlation.
One thing that I think about is concentration of targets, right? So like Seattle is a good example, and they're going to be owned partly because of this, but Russ to DK and Russ to Lockett are going to have such a huge percentage of Seattle's targets. I think people start to get worried when they're like, well, I'm just going to double stack or I'm going to triple stack just to try to cover all my bases, but maybe that's not right. And people also say, hey, how can three guys or how can two guys on this team go off? They're going to be stealing touchdowns from each other. How do you think about double stacking and even triple stacking, Dink?
Yeah, so concentration of targets is definitely a point that you want to consider strongly. In general, when you're stacking offenses, you want to stack offenses where the targets are pretty concentrated. It varies year to year in terms of how offenses end up spreading out those targets based on their personnel. So it's something that you do need a little bit of time or some forecasting to hit on early in the season. But the other point I wanted to just mention there is, again, just like Mike was talking about with field size, in terms of, smaller fields, you might be able to get away with a little bit more of, triple stacks simply because you need less to hit perfectly. It's the same thing with smaller slate sizes. So if you're playing like the afternoon slates or the late slates or different things like that, there's fewer combinations that are going to beat you, fewer combinations that are going to get to the tops of the triple stack. It can be more effective there. I know, Adam, you and Andrew like to play those late slates with cash and the afternoon slates and whatnot. They can be definitely diversifiers. And so if you're playing those types of slates, I think triple stacks are well within reason. But my base is a double stack. The way that I think about stacking is generally how much of the upside for this quarterback can come from his legs. If it can come a lot from his legs, I'm open to single stacking. So guys like Josh Allen, guys like Lamar Jackson, guys like, at times Russell Wilson, although they've scaled back his rushing attempts the last few years, those guys I might be okay single stacking even in really large field tournaments. But in general, double stack is kind of my base expectation. And I do not, at this point, Lamar would be the only guy, and he's too expensive to kind of make it work that I would run naked in these large field tournaments. And so I'm generally always stacking someone at least once in these tournaments.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add to that, when you're thinking the double stack too, if you're looking at DraftKings versus Fanduel, DraftKings, it's easier to stack more guys because the full point per reception and the bonus is 100 yards make it easier for multiple pass catchers to pay off. Adam, you mentioned people get worried that only one guy can score the touchdowns, but you're on DK, one guy goes 4 for 60 with 2 touchdowns. The other guy goes 8 for 100. And these guys both have massive games, even though one guy didn't score the touchdown. So definitely keep how the scoring system affects things in the back of your mind.
Yeah, that's a good point for sure. It's funny. I remember I was at a live final in I think it was 2016. And I forget who, but somebody came up to me and was like, I have this concept that's going to blow your mind. Everybody stacks, but nobody double stacks. And I was like, oh, mind blown. I think now what people think is the mind blown thing is bringing it back. And so what I mean by bring it back is when you run a double stack. So we play Stafford and Galladay and Marvin Jones. And if they're playing the Bears, we also play Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson would be called the bring back. This is very in vogue. I think this is something that a lot of people are doing now. I think a lot of people are wondering, is this right? It certainly makes sense from an intuitive perspective. Is bringing it back with our double stacks and frankly, single stacks too. Is that right, Leone?
It's definitely right. We saw the top 10 teams, the Millie Maker brought an opponent back on their stack at a higher rate than the field did. And most of the time this was at the wide receiver position. And I think it's helpful on a couple of reasons. One, if you want your stack to hit, you want it to be a bit more of a shootout type game. So there should be a lot of pass attempts to go around on both sides of the ball. And the second reason I like bringing it back is sometimes it forces you into a receiver you might not have taken otherwise. And what we'll see when we look at some more stuff of the Millie Maker research we did is that wide receiver is a higher variance position. It's a position that you generally want to go a little bit lower ownership at. And doing a double stack with bringing back an opponent wide receiver might put you on someone you might not normally have taken. Someone the field might not necessarily be on, but will benefit quite a bit if your double stack goes off.
Yeah. Drew, have you come around? Were you bringing it back before? Have you recently started bringing it back more? What are your whole thoughts on bringing it back?
So I think it's an absolute necessity. I would say the last 2 years, I've pretty much run every lineup with a bring back. It was probably 3 years and out that I started to adjust this concept a little bit more. I was probably late to the game on it, but it's an absolute necessity for all the reasons that Mike outlined. And really what you're looking for to maximize upside in these tournament lineups is you're looking for a couple big plays that speed up the pace of the game, that make the two teams feel like they need to be chasing points a little bit more. And you can have this in there's so many different directions that this can work, right? Like if your main stack plays from ahead early in the game and then the bring back is playing from behind, they can get a lot of kind of garbage time targets and just get there. And especially on DraftKings, like Mike alluded to, because of the full PPR, because of the 100-yard bonuses, you can get receivers who don't score touchdowns who still end up in kind of the winning Millie Maker lineups. And so as a result, you don't necessarily need the game environment to go nuts. You just need there to be a high pass percentage to kind of get there. And so a lot of times what I've looked at in tournaments is I've targeted game totals that are a little bit lower than the top game totals on the slate, which I think will drive ownership down, but have two offenses that have high pass percentages. And maybe they're playing against pretty good defenses that are keeping the totals in check, but I can get there on reception volume and not necessarily points alone. And so I think looking for high pass percentage games, looking to bring back those stacks, I think those are keys to building good tournament lineups.
Yeah, for sure. Before we get to ownership, which I want to talk about in a second, we should probably spend a minute on Fanduel versus DraftKings. We've mentioned it a few times. I mean, I think what you guys are alluding to is that Fanduel is just so touchdown heavy. I mean, we're trying to get all the touchdowns possible into our lineup. On DraftKings, we can be more creative. We can do different things. The thing that I've noticed, I mean, and I'm sure everybody has, I mean, you can often build just straight all-star teams on Fanduel. And on DraftKings, we got to dig a little bit deeper. You know, we're going to play some guys that are thinner on DraftKings. Oftentimes on Fanduel, it's just like, hey, I have a Pro Bowl lineup. You just have to be aware that just because you think you have a Pro Bowl lineup, a lot of other people also have Pro Bowl lineups. But Drew, what do you think about in terms of Fanduel versus DraftKings when playing large field tournaments?
Yeah, I think the big thing is really, really emphasizing touchdowns on Fanduel. You have to find the best scoring environments. And so that's where you want to try to target games that you know, are going to have more, more aggressive fourth down play callers and different things like that, where they're not going to be teams settling for field goals. I think it also increases the value of the running back position a little bit more on Fanduel. So all this flex stuff, all the data that we're talking about is from DraftKings because we have access to that data. But I think on Fanduel, you'll see some similarities or maybe even more stretched exaggerations of the running back position being much more valuable kind of in that flex spot. And I think also on Fanduel, one of the things that because touchdowns separate things so much, I think tight ends, you really are going to see a lot more of the high profile premium tight ends in the winning lineups on Fanduel because they're the guys who are utilized heavily in the red zone. They're the guys who can have the 2 touchdown games. You can't really get there on, as much on Fanduel on like the guy who goes 6 for 60 at the tight end position. You really need the touchdown. Whereas on DraftKings, you get 6 for 60 from like, a 3.5K guy, and that might be enough on a lower scoring slate. Really much harder to do that on Fanduel. So I think in general, you might spend up a little bit more at the tight end position on Fanduel. And because the pricing is usually a little bit softer, you can kind of still build those Pro Bowl type rosters.
Yeah. To be clear, the only reason we don't have a Fanduel version of this article up is because they don't release the CSVs. Correct me if I'm wrong, Leone, but we got this data from our friends at Fantasy Labs, their contest dashboard, publicly available, all the data. You can see all the teams, all the ownership, all that on the contest dashboard. Fanduel does not release the CSV, so that's why we did not have a Fanduel version of this article up on the site. Okay, last point I want to talk about in terms of building lineups before we get to listener questions is ownership. And this is, everybody just wants to talk about ownership. And I think that there is so much FPS out there. People want to know, FPS, by the way, fancy play syndrome. People want to know, in order to win, I have to have all guys under 5%. Like, you're a donkey. You played a guy over 25% in the Millie Maker. You can't win, you sick fish, you chalk eater, you chalk donkey. And like, I just can't. One of the reasons I can't play tournaments is I can't like take that kind of rhetoric. But anyways, can we correct these people, Leone? What should we be thinking about generally in terms of ownership in large field tournaments? Then we'll get into some specifics.
Yeah, I mean, the average total ownership of teams that finished top 10 in the Millie Maker was 116%. The average ownership of the field total was 121%. So you're not talking a huge difference. You definitely want to skew towards less total ownership. And if you wanted to pin specifics down on it, probably around 100%, give or take, is where you want the total ownership of your team to reside. But you could go a little bit higher. You just don't want to get above that 150% clip where you're just way too concentrated on chalk and it's tougher to get leverage. And I think people sometimes too concentrate so much on not being duped, which is super important. That's step one, is don't be duped, but you also want to be able to create leverage on the field. You want to be able to disproportionately benefit from something happen that's kind of like a coin flip, and that's why taking a lower owned player, you can benefit quite a bit. But as far as zooming out and taking a more general approach, getting away from those specific numbers, the really high touch running backs that have these huge ceilings that just can't be replicated, when they're good plays, they're good plays. And that's where you don't want to get fancy play syndrome. Some of these 4K running backs, he's a cheap pass catching running back. he can get to 3x, 4x. That's not going to win you the tournament. So I think you can totally play these chalky running backs if they're worth it. I wouldn't play chalk ever just because it's chalk, but if you think it's the right play because of the volume upside there, go for it. Where you want to differentiate, things like DST, the correlation of ownership to fantasy points, the correlation of salary to fantasy points, it's really low. It's super volatile. There's no reason to chase the chalk there. And then receiver, as I mentioned earlier, is a spot that has higher variance because even the best guys are seeing less opportunities. They might see 10 targets a week, which, if they catch 5 of them, which can happen given the variance of catch rate on a week, is totally, that's going to be a disappointing week. And you can get a ceiling from a guy who's only going to see 6 targets if he breaks a couple of really long plays. So there's a lot more room to get cute at wide receiver than there is at running back. And I think the key again is you want your total ownership to be somewhat constrained, and you want to probably play 1 or 2 low owned guys, but you don't have to go out of your way to avoid every single chalky guy. If you avoid every single good play on the slate, you're just, the probability of you getting enough points is just not high enough.
Right. I want to give people, zoom out for a second and let people know a little bit about what Leone was saying. Total ownership just means simply adding up all the ownership percentages in your lineup. Leone is saying, don't let it go above 150. Around 116 was the winner of the top 10s over the last 3 years. And I know what people are saying. Well, how do I know what the ownership is going to be before the tournament? Shout out to me. I actually think that my ownership projections are really good and as good as you're going to find. I think I have my finger on the pulse of what people are going to do a lot. And sure, there'll be some mistakes, but I think in the long run, it's pretty accurate. And so I have ownership projections up on the site. And so you can look at those and see how owned your team is projected to be in a range basis. And I also want to say this. There's difference between having 9 guys in your lineup at 15% owned and having maybe 3 at 30% owned and then a few at sub 5%. That's a way different construction, right? So like I would encourage people to think about your ownership, not just in total ownership, but how you got there. Like having 9 guys at 15% owned is just a disaster. So anyways, Drew, how do you think about ownership? Anything else that we haven't hit?
Yeah, I do think of ownership in the context of total ownership. And I'd say that most of the weeks, some of the weeks I'll adjust the threshold that I'm running things or capping things at in terms of a total ownership. For example, if there's like a 3K backup running back chalk that's going to be like 80% owned, but I can't find another play that I think replicates anywhere near the upside and I'm going to lock him 100%, then I'll adjust my ownership threshold up a little bit because I'm accounting for like this guy is just going to take up so much of this that I need to leave some room to have some other play that's more than 10% owned essentially in my lineup. So I would generally run my ownership thresholds around 105%, maybe 110%. The reason I run it a little bit lower than the numbers that Mike gave is generally what I found is the ownership projections when they do miss, they tend to be a little bit lighter on the top guys. They tend to a little bit underestimate. So I'm giving myself a little bit more room so that my total lineups end up usually being capped around 115 if I run it at 105, just based on the way things kind of end up. I think it's important. I think if you're building a lineup or 2 by hand or 10 by hand or 20 by hand, thinking about in the context that you relayed about, wanting to have at least a player or 2 that is generally off the radar and not just a slew of 15% guys is important. I think that's harder to, work through with optimizers or kind of building on a big level. But if you are hand building, I think that's really important. And Mike, you have the data on how often players were used in winning lineups or top 10 lineups that were 5% or less owned, right?
Yeah, I do. And what we saw is, as far as the chalk players, it wasn't that different between the field and the top 10 teams. Where we saw some differentiation really was the top 10 teams, they used a sub 5% player a lot more. And this is the milli maker. So you might not be shooting for a super risky player in a smaller field tournament, but the idea is you want to make 1 or 2 pivots off the chalk that make a ton of sense. And it's hard not to go down the rabbit hole where, let's say I have, AJ Brown, I think he's going to score 20 points, and the field is on him too, though. They think he's going to score 20 points. He's going to be 70% owned. And then there's, Tyler Lockett, who I think is going to score 18 points, but he's only going to be 10% owned. And you look at that dynamic, it's like, well, I should definitely play Tyler Lockett, because what we think is going to happen, we're not that confident. There's such, range of variance there. that you want the lower owned player. Where it gets difficult is sometimes you could do that down the line of your whole lineup, and all of a sudden you took the player you think is going to do worse at every point, and the probability of Lockett beating AJ Brown might be 55-45, and you disproportionately benefit that 45% of the time. But if you need the 45% of the time to hit all the way down your lineup, and this is oversimplified looking at one player versus another, you can start to see where, that's just not going to happen, and it's just a bad lineup. So you really want to find a couple of spots where you can make those pivots. And sometimes it's not even straight line pivots. And part of the reason why I think the stacking works out is almost forces you into a contrarian build where maybe you aren't doing a straight line pivot from one receiver to another similar priced receiver, but you build this game stack with 2 wide receivers and a bring back, and all of a sudden what you can afford with the rest of your positions might not fit the chalky construction for the week. And you've already pivoted without even really making a conscious choice to do so outside of the stack you chose.
Yeah. And the ownership leverage is something you guys are going to talk a lot about on Saturday, but honestly, just like a really high level, what Mike is saying is one of the main points. If guys are projecting the same and one's going to be 5 times as owned as the other, obviously in tournaments in a vacuum, that guy, the lower owned guy, is going to be better if they're projecting the same. Goes without saying, you guys are going to talk a lot about that.
Yeah, just to crystallize that thought process, the way to think about it kind of big picture is which projection do you have more confidence in the accuracy of? Adam's ownership projections or the actual projections of the player performance? And in this case, in the NFL, a sport that has a little bit higher variance, the answer is undoubtedly Adam's ownership projections. So you should put more weight on that number than the other number that you're looking at in terms of a player performance. Now, if we were in some other game where we could theoretically project perfectly the player performance, we would ignore the ownership projection, right? Because we know what the result of the player performance is. But in a sport like football where there is higher variance, because touchdowns can drive value and big plays can really separate players, you want to lean on that ownership projection when making decisions between somewhat similar players. You always want to lean on the ownership. If there's a wide gap in the ownership and the player projections are somewhat similar, take that lower owned ownership projection.
And if you want to ignore all this and just play the best plays, you can join me in the cash game streets. Okay. Let's get to listener questions. We got a lot of listener questions, and I think we got some really good ones. So I want to get to these. We'll just bang through these quickly, but I do want to get to all of them. From Jeff Edelstein. Jeff actually edited my book. Shout out to Skin to Fur. If you're an in-season subscriber to Slavish Run, you get this ebook for free. It's one of the most important, the seminal novels of our generation. Okay, he says, when max entering, I can't believe Jeff is max entering. Shout out to you, Jeff. When max entering, how many defenses should be in the pool? Related, let's say I love one defense, it's 50% too much or too little. Same question to a lesser extent for individual players. And yeah, I would encourage people to go to the Millie Maker article and look at the correlation between ownership and defense and defensive production, because we are very bad. The field is very bad at projecting how defenses will turn out. But anyways, any answer for Jeff here, Leone?
Yeah, the correlation you mentioned, for not to get too nerdy, but the correlation for all the other positions outside of defense is like 0.5, which means about 25% of the variance can be explained by the ownership as far as correlation of ownership to points. And for DST, it's 0.14. So very little of the variance in how many fantasy points defenses are scoring can be explained by ownership. That's a long fancy way of saying we're really bad. The field is really bad at predicting how many points defense is going to score. And this makes a ton of sense when you think about it, because it's the one position where, well, I shouldn't say the one position, but it's the number of opportunities you're going to get is about the same for all the teams, but the percentage of big plays that occur from those opportunities is really small. A kick return for a touchdown, a pick six. And we can somewhat explain that by, a really good defense versus a bad offense. But for the most part, the fact that a fluky play can totally shift how many fantasy points a defense scores on the week should dictate you to taking a contrarian approach there. And I think if you're playing a full max entering set, you don't want to be too tied down to one defense, especially if it's a chalk defense. It's really a position you don't want to buy into the chalk. Every now and then there's a chalk defense that smashes, and it's really discouraging, but you have to stick with the process and just know we cannot predict defenses very accurately. The variance there is huge. I like to spread out my bets at defense quite a bit, but if I am going to center around one or two defenses, you better believe they're going to be defenses that are going to be lower owned.
How many defenses in the pool, Dink?
I don't limit the player pool on defenses, but I do cap my ownership exposure. So my exposure, I won't own more than 15 to 20% of a single defense. I just think it's a position that, because we're so bad at predicting it, you want to kind of cover your bases on. You want to have a lot of different options that you can kind of funnel through. And so I don't want to have 50% of my exposure to one defense. That to me is not how I'm going to play as a max entry player. Now, if you're only playing like 10 lineups or 20 lineups or 5 lineups, the exposures naturally get more concentrated. So you have to make some decisions like that. But for me, with a full 150, I'm generally not above 15% on most of the defenses I own.
Jeff Schreiber sent in a question. He says the separation between winning $1 million or 100 in a given week is often defense. This seems crazy. He says, should sites just eliminate it because it's more volatile? I mean, let's be honest, guys. Like, we're obviously out here grinding and we're super nerdy and we're into it. Increasing variance is going to increase the player pool on DraftKings, and it makes it more fun for people. If it was just all a game for all of us nerds to win all the time, like, there has to be some variance involved, and we're doing our best to compensate for that variance at the defense position by talking about the strategies we just talked about now. But yeah, just like if DraftKings optimized the game where it was so all the nerds, all of us would just win every time, that wouldn't be fun, right? Same thing with poker. Like, if you get it in with aces versus kings, like, is the hand over? Do you automatically win? No, you run it out, and sometimes you lose, and that's how worse players stay in the game and stuff like that. So yeah. Okay. Next question. Question 3. Dustin Boucher. He says, what stat do you focus on first per position? We'll start with Dink here. We don't have to go through the most important stat for every position. I think people are curious how to start their lineup. Like, just from scratch, how do I figure out what stats I should be looking at?
Okay, so generally for quarterbacks, the best indicator for quarterback production is generally team total. You want quarterbacks that get the bulk of their production through touchdowns. So you want quarterbacks that are going to be able to score touchdowns or throw for touchdowns. Running back and wide receivers is generally volume-based stuff. So for wide receivers, it's going to be targets. For running backs, it's going to be touches. For tight ends, a lot of it's going to be, for me, targets, but also routes run, I think is really, really important. And then for defenses, I think some of the stuff that we highlight on Establish the Run in terms of the differences between the offensive line and the defensive line in terms of our valuations and the ability to generate pressure, I think those are really the important things. And I want defenses that not only can generate pressure, but are facing opponents that are willing to pass often. I want as many pass attempts as I can get against my defense. I do not care how many points my defense allows. They can allow 30 points for all I care. If they go out there and get 5 sacks and 2 picks, I'm going to still score pretty well.
Yeah, I think people are looking for like some advanced stats, some magic bullet. Honestly, like, opportunity is going to be the biggest correlator to a lot of the points. And that's what I would encourage people to focus on. And that's why, like, you don't see me out here tweeting about, some like FPS stat and stuff like that. I'm tweeting about who is going to be on the field, tweeting about who is going to get the ball.
Broken tackles, that's what's no broken tackles tweets.
I'm tweeting about sex. I'm tweeting about the important stuff. So yeah, Leone, I know you're the stat guy. Go ahead.
There aren't really that many advanced stats. I know you did a podcast with Frisco Josh, and he outlined some really good stats to look at, and he'll look at those in the air yards by low model each week, which you're going to do an article interpreting those. I definitely encourage people to check it out. But really, at running back and wide receiver, it's opportunities. For running back, I guess I'd pin that down to like higher leverage opportunities. So yeah. I want goal line touches and I want targets. If I could pin it down to that. As Drew said, at quarterback, though, you really want quarterbacks that have a high percentage of their team's touchdowns in addition to the high team total. So when Josh Allen has a really high team total, we know the ceiling's massive because he obviously, if they throw for a touchdown, it's going to be him, but he also has a really high percentage of his team's rushing touchdowns. So if the Bills get to their team total, it's like you're going to be through Josh Allen. And then for the defense, as Dink said, when you face a lot of pass plays, your opportunities for the big players are just heightened. You get more opportunities for sacks, more opportunities for picks. And if we think those plays, the big plays like the pick sixes are somewhat random, then we want the people that are going to have the most chances at achieving that randomness. And a lot of times those defenses are under-owned because the teams that pass a lot, can be better offenses. Perfect storm is when it's a bad team that has to pass a lot due to game script, though.
Yeah. Shout out to Cam Newton for like 6 years of being able to play him with 3 implied points less than everyone else, but because he procured like 85% of Carolina's touchdowns, it was just a fantasy glory each and every week.
Yeah, the defense stuff is great. And obviously Brandon's helped us a lot with that, understanding offensive line, defensive line mismatches. He'll have an expanded part of his article up in the site this year about that. But yeah, I think that a big edge for me has been identifying defenses that I'm willing to spend down on, like 2K, 2,500, who are going to get to rush the passer a lot, and other people are spending 3,500. It's just such a big difference. Okay. Question 4 from Andy Pants. He says, is there an argument for playing the week 1 $5 Millie Maker on DraftKings? Other than pure entertainment, playing a tournament with over 1 million entries seems counterproductive. Yeah, and we already talked about this. I actually don't want to spend too much time on this. We talked about this at the top. If your goal is to enter and give yourself positive EV and expect to come out a winner, of course, those kind of tournaments are not going to be right. If your goal is to get in there, play for $5 and have fun, which is the vast majority of people should be doing, we can help you have more fun, hopefully help you get better sweats. But yeah, if you're out there grinding, of course, I would say, Dink, the $5 on DraftKings with 1 million entries is counterproductive.
Well, the other thing that I'll say is when you have 1 million entries, you have a good shot at being some overlay there. And so if there's overlay in any contest, it's always worth firing at because your expected value increases immediately. And like for me, $750 to throw out 150 lineups, like I'm in. Like this, like for like $750 for a shot at 1 million. Yeah, I have to have the absolute nuts, but I am in. So I'm excited about these tournaments. I like these. I know they're super hard to realize your expectation, but they're also not as draining on the bankroll as 3K a week firing at the millie. So I think it all depends on your bankroll and size, but also pay attention to overlay because when these they throw out these small dollar contests in week 1, and at times you get overlay, and they're even more worthwhile to fire out of those situations.
Just to hopefully make it clear for people, Dink is plus EV in the tournament. He's winning in the tournament. It could take him 400 years to realize his equity in that tournament.
And even if there's overlay, that's the case. So you do want to be careful and look at how much overlay. Obviously, there's a certain point where it's like, oh, it would be dumb not to at least throw in some entries because the overlay is so huge. But if it's right on the border, yes, your positive expected value is going to be good. It's going to be high. It's going to be on the positive side. But that doesn't mean you're going to realize it just because there's overlay, especially in something so top heavy and so many entries.
For sure. Okay. Question 5 from Ryan Seal. He says, where to start when building lineups? I usually plug in game stacks and then work people around it. Any advice or suggestions would be helpful. And yeah, I think a lot of people have this question. When you are building lineups from scratch, do you start with a stack and then build around it? Do you plug in the best plays and then build around it? What advice do you have, Drew, for people who are building lineups for tournaments by hand?
Absolutely. For a tournament lineup, I build around kind of a macro theme that I'm fitting at first. So for me, because as we talked through this pod, I'm mostly going to have a quarterback stacked with 2 skill players, and then I'm going to have someone bringing it back. I'm naturally game stacking, right? Like this is naturally a mini game stack. It might not be a full game stack where I'm getting like 5 skill players from the game or whatever, but I am correlating. So I'm thinking about the game that I want to target, the quarterback that I want to target. And from there, that fills out like half my roster, right? I get a quarterback, I get 2 pass catchers, and I get a bring back. And then the rest of the pieces, the way that I start to fit those in is I think through, is this game stack that I'm stacking, is it going to be highly owned? Is it going to be lightly owned? It's going to be highly owned. Okay, now start selecting from the lower owned players' buckets in terms of filling out those options. A lot of times that won't be the running backs, right? So it's those spare pieces that I'm looking at the wide receiver position. Now I have to choose from the low owned bucket. If my game stack is from the low owned bucket, now I can play some higher owned guys if I want to. But what I also try to do is, let's say I have 2 receivers or 2, like a receiver and a running back position left that are not part of my main game stack. I try to correlate those pieces as well. I want those players in the same game. So I'm now hoping that I catch the 2 games on the slate that really like kind of shoot out. And naturally, I have the game stack from one, and I have 2 correlated players from the other. And then if it's a modest scoring slate from the rest, I have a big advantage on the field. And so I think not only starting with your game stack, but thinking through, okay, those secondary players that are filling out the lineup, what bucket do they come from in terms of ownership? And then can I correlate them? And if you can, choose to do so.
Yeah. And also you can get like running back defense correlation in there and stuff like that. And yeah, this is where hand building is for sure an advantage. I mean, you can make a lot of lineups like that. And, we have all week, even Sunday morning, you could bang off, 10 hand built lineups that you think are really good. Leone, how do you think about building for these kind of smaller field lineups, smaller field tournaments by hand? Do you start with the stack also?
I not necessarily. I think of it as where's my biggest leverage for the week? Who is the best play that's going to be somewhat underutilized? And sometimes it's a game stack, and I do exactly what Drew says, but sometimes it's a one-off receiver, or sometimes it's a running back that's kind of chalky, and I just know I need to play them. And then I start thinking through things like Drew does, where it's a little bit of an if then, if this guy's chalky, differentiate. And sometimes this might bring you to, if you start with two chalky-ish running backs because you think you just have to play them on a week, sometimes that'll lead you to a pretty contrarian stack that you might not have otherwise played. So I'm thinking of the one or two things that I feel most confident in relative to the field, and I'm building out from there.
Okay. Question 6 from Joe Malcolm. And he points out that the new salary floor, and I don't know, this could just be a week 1 thing, DraftKings trying to protect themselves. And it might be that might be the case. But in week 1, the salary floor at the running back position on DraftKings is 4,000. He points out Chris Thompson, last season Chris Thompson may have been 3,300. This year he's 4K because that's the salary floor. He says, how do you expect that Newman price for running backs will affect lineup constructions? I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward. Guys who would have been 3K or now 4K are obviously going to be worse plays. Do you see any other effects, Drew, of this new salary floor, at least for week 1?
So I think it'll naturally push down some of the ownership on higher priced defenses, higher priced quarterbacks, and higher priced tight ends. Generally, those are the 3 positions when people are like building out their lineups that they're like, oh, I can save some salary here. I'll just pivot down. I'll just pivot down here. And so as a result, I think that if that sustains throughout the course of the season, you would see lower ownership week in and week out on probably Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson and Travis Kelce and George Kittle and whatever top defense is going to be of the week, whoever's playing Jacksonville or whatever. Like, I think those are going to be spots where the ownership just kind of sheds away from a little bit more. I don't think it'll be something that you'll like notice in a really big way, because I think the margins are going to be pretty small. Like maybe a Mahomes average ownership goes from like 15% down to like 12%. But I think those are things that are going to happen.
Yeah. Anything on that, Leone? I don't think there's too much to say.
I think it'll force the field to be a little bit sharper, which is unfortunate because, as we mentioned, with the expensive, chalky running backs that see a lot of volume, those are the best plays. And people tend to get cute with these running backs that just don't have the volume upside to win you a tournament. And now if people aren't going to play them, we want people playing those guys. Obviously, it's different if they're stepping into a workhorse role, but for the most part, the Chris Thompson types, they're just not good plays, even if they look like their point per dollar expectation is fine.
Right. Okay. Second to last question we're going to do comes from the Heisman. He says, there's a lot of content out there on cash games and MME. Can you talk about your approach to single entry GPP formats? And, I encourage people to play single entries. You're not going to win $1 million. Okay. But you have a much, much, much higher chance of getting to the top. And you obviously have a lot of people putting their cash lineup in. And, I try not to do it. I try not to put my cash game lineup into these single entry GPPs because so many people are doing so. And, it's just probably not winning enough. It's min cashing enough. It's not winning enough to be putting in there. But yeah, I would encourage people to play the single entries. Leone, what about strat for specifically single entry GPPs?
I think sometimes people make the mistake of thinking they don't need to be contrarian in single entry because everyone only gets one entry, when being contrarian in one or two spots can be even more beneficial in single entry because the ownerships get concentrated. You'll notice the ownerships in the Millie Maker on the chalk guys are less than the ownerships in a single entry contest. So it's not that you want to fade all those high owned guys, but the benefit of maybe making one big fade or of taking one or two low owned players is gargantuan in that field size with the ownership percentages you're going to get. And also to be able to make that pivot, you don't have to do something crazy a lot of the times because you're going to see less people getting exposures to players, deeper in the player pool because they're focused more on a cash game mindset and they're still too worried about floor in those settings. So I really think it's a great contest to play if you want a mix of play the best plays, but have that contrarian mindset where you get some upside out of really like soaking the leverage out of one or two pivot spots. So I love that format. I think that's the best contest. And again, the late swap on those contests too, a lot of times you can figure out what your opponents are doing with the ownerships being conflated and a lot higher. And that can give you outs with the 4:00 games, depending on how you're doing in the standings.
Yeah. Govan's View asked a question related to this about one lineup in across all the single entries. I want to make the point that, you can make 5 different lineups and find 5 single entry lineups. And so maybe you have $50 on each lineup, but it's not an MME. It's 5 different lineups, not in the same tournament. They're all in different single entry ones. I think to smooth out some variance, to give yourself a chance to get to the top of one of these tournaments, that would be the right thing if you had a smaller roll. Anything on single entry, Dink?
I think the point that you just highlighted is incredibly important. And I think people don't think through this enough, especially with football, where like last minute news, you still have plenty of time to tinker and adjust because it comes out like an hour and a half before the games. It's not like NBA where if you did that for NBA, you might be scrambling to kind of adjust 5 different lineups like right before lock. So in general with NFL, these prize pools are so big. A lot of them are really top heavy, even single entry or 3 max tournaments that you might find to your liking. And so really what you want to do is you want to give yourself as many chances as you can to find a lineup that creeps up to the top. And so I would strongly recommend building more lineups and putting them through individually in different single entry 3 maxes. I think putting all of your eggs in one basket on one lineup, certainly if you get it right, you will get rewarded heavily. But I think you're giving yourself less opportunities for your skill to shine through. The more lineups you're able to play, the more contests you're able to play over time, the more you're getting a real expectation of your skill to shine through. So if you are a skillful player, if you're playing with an advantage, you want to give yourself more chances to capture that EV at the very top of the payout charts.
All right. Last one we are going to do today, I think is a good question. He's from Pat. He says, how do you get your head out of season long and cash game mode? I assume a lot of people listening to this now are focused on their season long fantasy draft. I assume there's a lot of people like me who are focused on cash and find it hard to play both. I mean, quite frankly, it's extremely distracting to trying to be, have a ton of money on a cash game lineup and then be worrying about, like, oh, I got $200 or $100 on this lineup. Like, who cares? And it turns into just some dusty tournament lineup that's just incinerating money. And so I struggle with doing both. I assume there's some people out there who can. Any advice for people, Dink, though, transitioning out of season long, getting their head right for tournaments and transitioning out of cash?
Well, for season long, I really don't think season long is much different than DFS because season long, once you get to the point of like setting your rosters, it's a weekly game, right? So I don't think there's too much of a transition there. I think, the pricing that you'll see in season long does correlate to the pricing in week 1 in terms of where guys go in draft positions and stuff. So I don't think you need to make too many adjustments for that. The cash game versus the tournament, I do think is a really tough one to be great at both. I think football is a sport that gives you a little bit of a better chance because it gives you so much time to digest information and process information. But I do think it's really tough to be great at both. And so I would say that if you don't feel like you're great at one right now, focus on the one that you'd like to try to be great at, because I do think a lot of the concepts are different between the two games and the approaches are different. And I think it's easier to play with one mindset than a compartmentalized mindset split between 2 different styles.
Yeah. Leone, anything? I know you've been grinding season long. I see you're tweeting out drafts every night. I mean, you have to be on Team No Sex with all these stupid season long drafts that you're doing. How are you transitioning out of season long and cash into DFS?
So I would say early in the year, there actually might be some benefit to not transitioning out of season long. One concept in season long is to draft players you like long-term. You like AJ Brown for the next 3 or 4 years. You take him this year because maybe he's a slight overdraft, but if you're that confident in the player, he's going to have a huge year coming up one of these years. Maybe it's this year, and he's probably has a really strong floor if you feel that good about a player. So maybe you take him a little bit earlier than his median expectation. You apply that to DFS early in the year where there's a lot of unknowns as far as which defenses are going to be good, how teams are going to operate. I think there's an opportunity for you to get a lot of leverage taking guys you like in season long that might not have the best matchups week 1. They might not have the best pricing week 1. And it's the same concept. They're going to have a good week. They're going to have some spiked weeks throughout the year. Maybe it happens week 1 and the floor is probably better than people think. Just because the market's point per dollar expectation isn't great on that player doesn't mean you have to avoid them. If anything, that might help you get them at a lower ownership percentage. So I actually like using the season long mindset a lot very early in the season until we know a little bit more about the team characteristics.
All right. We have legit said it all. If you guys didn't learn a lot about how to play DFS and how to play DFS tournaments optimally here, I don't know what to tell you. I know a lot of you guys out there listening probably haven't played a lot of DFS. You're season long Players, if you want to give DFS a shot, upgrade your draft kit to the bundle. Again, email us support@establishtherun.com. We'll go ahead and get you upgraded. I would encourage everyone to check out what we have coming up in the in-season package. If you go to the About tab on the site, you'll drop down and you'll be able to see our 2020 in-season content schedule. It is everything we think that you need to win at DFS to win at season long. All right. Getting close, boys. Not far away now from the real deal. For Drew, for Mike, for producer Luke, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.